Hello everybody and welcome to the 8th YouTube session of the Pixel Project's 7th International Women's Day edition of our Read from Pixels campaign. My name is Anusha Kandasivam. I'm your moderator for this session. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 13 award-winning and best-selling women writers to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking. Now, I'll be telling you a bit more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser a little later. We have lots and lots of exclusive author goodies. But meanwhile, if you want to find out more about the Pixel Project, you can go to www.thepixelproject.net. Okay, so for today's session, we have a very special guest who will be doing a reading and a Q&A session. We have the fabulous fantasy author Tasha Suri. Tasha is an award-winning author, occasional librarian, and a cat owner. She has won the Best Newcomer E.J. Barnes Award for the British Fantasy Society, from the British Fantasy Society, and has been nominated for the Astounding Award and Locus Award for Best First Novel. She lives with her family in a mildly haunted house in London, which is very exciting. Hi, Tasha.
Hi.
Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. I promise it's only mildly haunted. It's absolutely fine.
Hopefully we don't get a visitor.
No. It'll be fine. It's I won't go into detail. It's a bit of a derailment, but there are some strange things in this house, but it's always been a nice place to live.
Okay, cool. Okay, anyway, moving on. So let me tell you, before we go on to the reading, Tasha has very generously donated a couple of awesome goodie bundles to this stash of author goodies that we have set up as perks for donors at our Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. So there are two, and let me tell you, the first goodie bundle is the Tasha Suri Fantasy Goodie Bundle. And this one has already been snapped up by Crystal Weber. But let me tell you what it is, and there you go. So it's a signed and personalized copy of Empire of Sand, Realm of Ash, and the ARC of the Jasmine Throne, which will be out in, is it July?
It's out in June the 8th.
And it also comes with 2 exclusive Jasmine Throne character cards.
I've come prepared, so there they are.
Oh, so cool. Yeah, but this one's been snapped up by Crystal Weber. So we want to say thank you very much, Crystal, for donating.
Crystal.
You'll get your bundle soon. But there is one more goodie left. So it's a 30-minute one-to-one video chat with Tasha. So Tasha has donated this 30-minute video chat for one Read for Pixels donor who is an aspiring author. Tasha will be happy to chat about the art and craft of writing and the business of publishing with you. And this one is available to donors worldwide. So there's only one left. Go and get it. We've raised $790 towards our $5,000 goal so far. It's our slowest fundraiser yet, so please do give generously before the fundraiser ends on April 15th. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. I'll be telling you how you can get your hands on all this swag a bit later, and we'll be sharing some links. Meanwhile, so if you're watching this on YouTube, you can also participate. You can type your questions for Tasha into the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. You must be logged into YouTube to do this. And Denisha, who is our producer today and chat box moderator, will relay them to us, and Tasha will answer the questions. Okay, so now we have the reading, and I do have to issue a trigger warning before Tasha starts. So a trigger warning for violence against women and immolation. So if you would like to skip the reading, go ahead, go and make yourself a cup of tea or some coffee. Come back in about 10 minutes for the Q&A and get your questions ready. But we're going to start. So take it away, Tasha, and tell us what you're reading from.
So I am reading from the Jasmine Throne, which it's actually quite heavy, so I've just had to pick it up and find the right page. I'm reading from the prologue, so this is from the very beginning of the book, and as Anisha said, there are trigger warnings for violence against women and immolation within the prologue, and if you do happen to pick up the book, I have trigger warnings on my website as well. So without further ado, I'll begin. In the court of the Imperial Mahal, the pyre was being built. The fragrance of the gardens drifted in through the high windows, sweet roses and even sweeter imperial needleflower, pale and fragile, growing in such thick profusion that it poured in through the lattice, its white petals unfurled against the sandstone walls. The priests flung petals on the pyre, murmuring prayers as the servants carried in wood and arranged it carefully, applying camphor and ghee, scattering drops of perfumed oil. On his throne, Emperor Chandra murmured along with his priests. In his hands he held a string of prayer stones, each an acorn seeded with the name of a mother of flame, Divyanshi, Ahamara, Nanvashi, Suhana, Minakshi. As he recited, his courtiers, the kings of Parijadvipa's city-states, their princely sons, their bravest warriors, recited along with him. Only the king of Vellore and his brood of nameless sons were notably, pointedly silent. Emperor Chandra's sister was brought into the court. Her ladies-in-waiting stood on either side of her. To her left, a nameless princess of Vellore, commonly referred to only as Allori. To her right, a high-blooded lady, Narina, daughter of a notable mathematician from Srugna, and a high-born Parijati mother. The ladies-in-waiting wore red, bloody and bridal. In their hair they wore crowns of kindling, bound with thread to mimic stars. As they entered the room, the watching men bowed, pressing their faces to the floor, their palms flat on the marble. The women had been dressed with reverence, marked with blessed water, prayed over for a day and a night until dawn had touched the sky. They were as holy as women could be. Chandra did not bow his head. He watched his sister. She wore no crown. Her hair was loose, tangled, trailing across her shoulders. He had sent maids to prepare her, but she had denied them all, gnashing her teeth and weeping. He had sent her a sari of crimson embroidered in the finest Thiralis gold, scented with needleflower and perfume. She had refused it, choosing instead to wear palest mourning white. He had ordered the cooks to lace her food with opium, but she had refused to eat. She had not been blessed. She stood in the court, her head unadorned and her hair wild like a living curse. His sister was a fool and a petulant child. They would not be here, he reminded himself, if she had not proven herself thoroughly unwomanly, if she had not tried to ruin it all. The head priest kissed the nameless princess upon the forehead. He did the same to Lady Narina. When he reached for Chandra's sister, she flinched, turning her cheek. The priest stepped back. His gaze and his voice were tranquil. "You may rise," he said, "rise and become mothers of flame." His sister took her lady's hands. She clasped them tight. They stood, the three of them, for a long moment, simply holding one another. Then his sister released them. The ladies walked to the pyre and rose to its zenith. They kneeled. His sister remained where she was. She stood with her head raised. A breeze blew needleflower into her hair, white upon deepest black. "Princess Malini," said the head priest, "you may rise." She shook her head wordlessly. "Rise," Chandra thought. "I have been more merciful than you deserve, and we both know it. Rise, sister." "It's your choice," the priest said. "We will not compel you. Will you forsake immortality, or will you rise?" The offer was a straightforward one, but she did not move. She shook her head once more. She was weeping silently, her face otherwise devoid of feeling. The priest nodded. "Then we begin," he said. Chandra stood. The prayer stones clinked as he released them. Of course it had come to this. He stepped down from his throne. He crossed the court before a sea of bowing men. He took his sister by the shoulders, ever so gentle. "Do not be afraid," he told her. "You are proving your purity, your honor. Now, rise." One of the priests had lit a torch. The scent of burning and camphor filled the court. The priest began to sing, a low, sonorous song that filled the air and swelled within it. They would not wait for his sister. But there was still time. The pyre had not yet been lit. As his sister shook her head once more, he grasped her by the skull, raising her face up. He did not hold her tight. He did not harm her. He was not a monster. "Remember," he said, voice low, nearly drowned out by that sonorous song, "that you have brought this upon yourself. Remember that you betrayed your family and you denied your name. If you do not rise, sister, remember that you have chosen to ruin yourself, and I have done all in my power to help you. Remember that." The priest touched his torch to the pyre. The wood slowly began to burn. Firelight reflected in her eyes. She looked at him with a face like a mirror, blank of feeling, reflecting nothing back at him but their shared dark eyes and serious brows. their shared blood and shared bone. My brother, she said, I will not forget. And that's the prologue.
That sounds awesome. And that was from the book that is going to come out in June, right?
Yes,
So,
the Jasmine Throne. I will
Jasmine
hold
Throne.
it up again.
Yes, getting us all excited for it. Cool. Okay, so let's go straight into some questions. Now, we just saw the beginnings of a really amazing character, Malini. Your book features some really fantastic female characters, Meher, Arwa, Lalita. They're all complex and they have their own driving forces. They have agency, but they're also very human. So my first question is, what or who are your inspirations for your female characters?
So, when I was writing my first two books, the Books of Amber, I talked a lot about the idea that I was very inspired by historical figures. I was inspired by people like Nur Jahan or Mumtaz Mahal, that I had heard about growing up, watching, films with my dad, who was really into his Bollywood films, and, listening to stories from my family. But I hadn't really seen reflected in the history that I'd learnt at school, or even in the popular historical fiction or nonfiction that I could read in typical Western bookshops, in the UK. But I think, and that's partly true. I was very inspired by some of the really interesting and innovative and often cruel things that women had done throughout history that we are not told about today. So we're not told often. I think there is a kind of assumption that women from South Asia or from anywhere that's not the West, frankly, were very demure and passive and never did anything interesting. And actually, that is not true. They suffered the same kind of mistreatment that women in the West suffered, but they also did very, very interesting things and had certain levels of agency that I think historically women, for example, from Britain, did not have in certain periods of history. So it's a more complicated picture. But I was also inspired by the women I know. So, as an example, when I was working on Realm of Ash, which stars Arwa, who's a widow, I thought a lot about the widows that were in my family. And I thought about, for example, the way that I'd seen my mother or my grandmothers cope with grief and deal with grief in a way that felt very specifically cultural. Like my dadi, my father's mother, stopped wearing any gold or jewelry and would only wear plain clothes, even if people encouraged her not to. And I thought that was her generation, but then a parent of one of my friends, started doing the same thing, and she was a completely different generation. And I started thinking about the ways that grief and strength are expressed, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit through fiction. And I think that the ways that the women in my books express strength or function within society or try and have a level of control is, although it's in a fantasy setting and they're dealing with high stakes, reflects the kind of quiet and complicated strength I saw in the women around me.
That's pretty cool. I guess I kind of understand what you mean as well. It's sometimes grief can be expressed in a very cultural way, and you don't really understand it sometimes. But yeah, cool. I really, what I'm saying is, I really like the way you portray these cultures in your books.
Thank you.
So my next question is, so all genres have their share of female stereotypes and tropes, and your characters can all be considered people of color, right? Which is very rare in science fiction and fantasy. And even when POC characters are included, they're often subjected to even more stereotypes and tropes. So how do you break stereotypes and subvert tropes to create female characters of color with agency while dealing with the world around her, including sexism, misogyny, and violence against women and girls, especially those who do not fit into culturally prescribed gender norms, including appearance and behavior?
I think that's a tricky one. I think on one level, there are a lot of women who are, damsels in distress who need to be saved. And there are a lot of women who are kick-ass and fighting and taking names in fantasy. And there are also a lot of women who are just sort of there to be sexy, which, is fine. And I don't think there's inherently anything wrong with any of those characters. What is wrong with them is that they're kind of all there is, or traditionally they were all that there was. And they also had no interiority. So I think the worst thing you can do with a character is kind of take away their humanity. And you can do that in ways that are, you know, if you just make a character come in and she's sexy and she walks in and she's sexy and she's there to be sexy and that's her main characteristic, you've taken away her humanity. You've made her into an object. And I think a lot of fiction does that, both by men and women, because we pick up societal beliefs or societal narratives about what it means to be a woman in a story. What is the point of view? What is the point of a woman? And if the point of a woman is there to be eye candy, then that's all she is. And sometimes an author will throw a character in and that's how they will treat her, whether they mean to or not. In terms of women of color, I think that it's a complicated one because women of color who are Black are dehumanized in different ways from, say, Southeast Asian women or South Asian women. So that's a complicated picture. But for the specific background that I'm from, I think that often there's this kind of Western view that, these Indian women, they're so demure and they're so quiet and they do what they're told, and they have these arranged marriages and they're really bullied by everybody around them. And what becomes complicated is I hate those stereotypes, and I hate that that's how women of color are depicted in the historical traditional narrative of Western fiction. But I also want to leave space to tell stories about women of color that deal with misogyny and patriarchy and male violence. And finding that balance is difficult. And I think the answer is the same answer that you have to apply to stories where you have the sexy woman or the kick-ass woman that has no interiority. What you want to do is show the human side of somebody within those situations and the complicated negotiations that any human being has to do when they're dealing with violence or having their power taken from them or having their consent taken from them. You need to depict their interiority. So in Empire of Sand, I wanted to look at a stereotypical trope. I wanted to look at a woman who is forced into an arranged marriage, because I'd read it so many times by white authors, and I thought, why don't I get to do that? If they get to do it, why can't I? And you could argue that perhaps telling those stories that are sort of inherently patriarchal and toxic isn't so much breaking stereotypes as reinforcing them. But my personal view was that I wanted to depict that story, explore consent and choice and free will and love, and also explore the interiority and the experience of being in that situation. And Meher, who is the heroine of that story, she's often in positions where she has very little power, but her strength lies in taking control of what she can take control of. And I think that is true of a lot of real women in the world. So that's a very long way of answering, but essentially I think that we need to do a lot more work exploring how real and human people are, including women of color, which I think they have long been denied in fiction.
Yeah, okay, I get what you mean. Well, actually, you kind of answered my next question, because I was going to ask you, I was going to say, she lives this life of contrast, right? She's born into a life of incredible privilege, but she's given very little agency in where she goes and who she sees. And in the society you've created, Amban women are respected and honored, but they're also considered sort of fragile and precious possessions that must be protected from the outside world. So I suppose I guess you answered the question of why you chose to create the society that gives women some agency, but not complete freedom.
Yeah. I think it's also kind of true to a lot of women's experiences that sometimes the ways that you were limited by other people, you're told are good, if that makes any sense. Like, oh, my daughter is precious to me, which is why I don't let her go out late at night. Or, you were valued and important, which is why you should wear long dresses or, shouldn't wear tight jeans, because we don't want people to think that you're not valued. And there are so many kind of underlying societal things under those kind of assumptions. So Meher is, she's valued and she's loved. She's very loved by her father, but her life is very limited, and in some ways that love is very damaging. And I think that's also true in Arwa's book, because the things that denote your value and your safety are also the things that limit your life and deny you the kind of the freedom that men may have in your society. So it's quite a complicated picture. But then, of course, when she gets her privilege taken away from her and she ends up in this marriage and serving this evil, immortal priest figure, not having that protection is no better either. So, you know, everything sucks.
Okay, so do you think it's better to write a world where everyone thinks it's normal that all genders are equal and that female characters have power or drive plots forward, an ideal world? Or do you think people should write patriarchy and sexism to reflect the real world?
I wish there was more of both. I don't think there are enough books that explore worlds of gender equality. I think that, let me try that again. There are a lot of books that that depict patriarchal worlds without ever interrogating the patriarchy they're depicting. So you will find books that, for example, depict women being raped, which is a real thing that happens and is awful. But when you ask the author, why did you depict that? They will say, because it's realistic. Okay, so if you're writing a medieval world, why are you not depicting the bread that has mold in it that gives people like LSD-like hallucinations? That's real. That really happened. Why does everybody have good teeth? That, you know, it's the choices that are made about what to depict in a fantasy world or in a historical fiction or whatever it may be, that are subconscious. So I think a lot of the time depictions of violence against women are recreated and replicated in fiction over and over again without anybody ever thinking about why they're being replicated or what is being said by this. Are you just replicating harm, or are you saying something about that harm? Are you saying these are bad things that really happen and this is how this character copes with it? Or are you just saying these are bad things that happen and I think you might want to read about that, which is a slightly different thing. So I'd like to see more fiction that really thinks about the violence it's depicting and why it's there and what its purpose is. I think that would make for more meaningful stories that interrogate and provide perhaps ways for catharsis and thoughts about violence against women. But I'd also like to see more worlds that are equal, where, you know, it's not just patriarchy. I want to see other systems. And I think that Samantha Shannon did that very well in Priory of the Orange Tree, and there are a few other books that have done it in a really interesting way, but it would be great if there was more of it.
Okay. Yeah, it would.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. So your story is sort of Asian or South Asian inspired. You've created this world and filled with people of color. There is discrimination against characters who have darker skin or who come from other clans or other parts of the world. And as usual, for women, it's compounded by sexism and misogyny. Could you tell us what kind of feedback have you received about the depiction of the particular experiences of sexism or misogyny or racism or just subconscious prejudice faced by the women of color in your books?
Feedback is an interesting one because I try and avoid any feedback that's not directly sent to me. But I know that it's interesting to see the difference between responses from Indian readers and Western readers. So I think, for example, Indian readers know that I am, you know, light-skinned, that I'm reflecting things that are not necessarily my experience, and they interrogate it accordingly, which is right. Whereas Western readers aren't necessarily aware of that. But I think that often when Western readers approach my books, they think about British imperialism and the way that British imperialism impacted places like India, which is kind of a reasonable thing to think because I know a lot more about British imperialism being somebody in Britain and therefore want to explore that a little bit in my work, rather than about the particular kind of tensions within that you'd expect with colorism, I suppose. And what kind of feedback have I had particularly? I think that the sense that I've got is that there are not enough stories by women of color, particularly Desi women, you know, across the diaspora or from India itself or South Asia, that explore our particular experiences of misogyny impacted by race and by colorism. And there need to be more of those. I can only say so much in an interesting way. And hopefully I explored what I wanted to say meaningfully, but there need to be a lot more books, basically.
Okay. Do you ever feel any pressure, or do you feel pressured by gender and cultural stereotypes to make your female characters likable or relatable? Have you ever got any flack for not making any female characters likable enough?
I've definitely had sort of responses along the lines of, which I knew I would get. I knew I would get that, oh, the main character in Empire of Sand doesn't have enough agency. She doesn't do anything. And I'm like, okay, you're missing the point, but fine. It's, you don't have to agree with the point I'm trying to make. Or the main character in Realm of Ash is too sad. I'm like, okay, she's a widow. She's going to be sad. I think that what defines a likable character in women is quite narrow. What makes a likable woman is quite narrow, frankly. She kind of has to be cheerful and friendly, but not too friendly, but not too cheerful. She has to have pathos, but not too much pathos. She can't be too sad about things. She can't complain too much, but she has to be a little bit sad, so it shows that she has empathy. She can be angry, but not too angry. She must be active and have agency, but she mustn't do things that are bad. And it's quite complicated. But that said, I do think that there are a lot more readers who really want more complicated, nuanced women in their fiction. They want to see people more like themselves, and we are complicated people. So you both get reviews which are very negative about your character's agency or whatever it might be, and you have people who go, this really resonated with me, this really reflected my experience of dealing with the complexities of my own family or dealing with trauma, and that I think that is more meaningful. You're writing for those people rather than for the ones that are looking for a specifically quote unquote likable character. There are plenty of likable female characters in fiction. We don't all have to write them.
Yeah.
In The Jasmine Throne, I made a point of trying to write women who were less likable. I wanted to explore Princess Marlene is driven by revenge and is manipulative and makes no bones about that. She is not afraid of being manipulative, and she is not ashamed of being manipulative. And I like that. That was really fun to write. And I hope that it's also cathartic for readers, because as much as there are people who want likable characters, there are also those of us who want to read a character who'll burn it all down for us and just let it all out.
Yeah. It's exciting, isn't it?
Yeah.
We need characters like this.
Yeah, because generally we're not allowed to do that. So
yeah, true. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So your books definitely passed the Bechdel test with the inclusion of complex relationships between women. Why do you think many SFF authors still have trouble writing stories that pass the Bechdel test, despite the fact that there are so many more things that women talk about other than men? And what can you suggest for writers who want to write female conversations and relationships realistically?
I don't think that there is the authors who struggle to pass the test. I don't think that they want to. I don't think it's that hard to write women talking to women about things that are not men. I find it quite hard to write women talking to women about men. I find that very difficult because we don't generally do it very often. I think that sometimes if you're writing a story that is centered, like, to be more serious, writing a story that is centered on male experiences, so on men in war, or, here's a group of friends going on an epic adventure, or whatever it might be, it can be difficult to work out where to include women except as parts of men's stories. And if you are writing about, let's say, a typical cis heterosexual man, where women fit in his story will be as mothers, sisters, or love interests. Now, and that kind of limits them to only talking about men again. So that's me being kind. I can see how that could happen. But in truth, I think, again, it is that recreation of narratives that assume women don't have interiority and don't have their own lives. And I think if authors who want to depict women more meaningfully sit down and think about what that woman's life must be like and what really concerns her, they may find that they're instantly building up a more layered and rich character who isn't just centered around a man. And because, frankly, nobody just thinks about one other person. That isn't anybody's whole life, whether they be man or woman. And so there has to be more there. I think I just think that if you have to think of women as people, and they're as
Yeah.
much people as men.
Mhm.
I can't think of any other way to describe it. I remember reading somewhere somebody saying, how would you even write from a woman's perspective? And I thought, well, just write a human being's perspective and then
Yeah.
go from there. And it requires a little bit of empathy because you have to understand the particular concerns and fears and life pressures that women experience. But most men know women in real life and hopefully do know the particular concerns, pressures, and experiences of those women in their lives. If you can translate your own experiences into your male character, surely you can do the same for women, since you have met women. I'm sorry, I'm not being very sympathetic to people who can't write women very well, but I just don't think it's that hard. So
Yeah. No,
yeah,
agree as well. Yeah, you're right. I mean, women are people,
yeah.
so you should be able to write them. Okay, so we are getting a few questions from the audience. Let me see. Let me put one up. Go. Oh, okay. So here's a question from Roxy Wilson. Hi, Roxy. And she says, "Hello. Is your main character inspired by someone, a film, or historic figures that you know?"
Oh, okay. I guess it depends which book, doesn't it? So in Empire of Sand, which is my first book, which we've discussed a fair bit, I was very inspired by Nur Jahan, who was the empress wife of one of the Mughal emperors. I didn't use a lot of stuff about Nur Jahan, shockingly. I think you should go read about her because she's very cool. She used to like shoot tigers and things. Interesting woman. But it was her story that inspired me to write about Meher because she was just a very different figure who did very interesting things. And I thought, why have I not read other stories about South Asian women doing similar things or having very interesting adventures within this time period? And that inspired me. In terms of my other books, The Jasmine Throne, which is out in June, I was broadly inspired by the women in a lot of the epics that I grew up watching on television or reading, so largely Hindu epics. So people like, I guess, Radha and Sita, but probably more Draupadi from the Mahabharata was a very inspiring figure and inspired Malini's character to some extent. If you go read about her, that will probably give you some spoilers, but you may as well, if you want to, do a little bit of reading. So it was sort of very broadly, I was inspired by women in myth and epic or religio myth, but also some figures like Nur Jahan. If you look her up, she's really cool.
Okay, sort of related question from Misty36. Hi, Misty. Was Arwa from Realm of Ash based on Arwa, the historical figure?
No.
Okay.
I just really like the name. I'm sorry.
Okay. I don't know who this Arwa is, but I mean, your Arwa is pretty cool.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so we'll get to more of the audience questions later. Keep them coming, everyone. It's always cool to have your questions. But I have more questions for you, Tasha. So
Okay.
we've been talking about women. Let's talk about men. There's a wide range of male characters in your stories, from really heinous misogynistic villains to men who treat women really respectfully and equitably. Do you think reframing how stories describe men away from hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability can be one of the ways SFF writers can break away from toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
Yes. I mean that's the short answer, but I've always loved I kind of think that a lot of my writing is very kind of romance heavy, even The Jasmine Throne, which is a more traditional epic fantasy in some ways. And The Jasmine Throne has a sapphic romance, so it's two women. But both Empire of Sand and Realm of Ash have have straight love relationships in them at the center of the story. And one thing I really wanted to explore with both of those is how to write a story where, to some extent, the men grapple with toxic masculinity and the expectations that places upon them, and find a way to have equal footing with their love interests. Because, frankly, we all know toxic masculinity is toxic and poisonous to men as much as it is to women. It's a poison to the whole of society. And I don't think it does men any favors either. A lot of what I've said sort of implies I don't think much of men, which is not true. I know quite a lot of them. I really loved writing Alman in the first book, in Empire of Sand. And he has a lot of things placed upon him, the idea that he is beastly or violent or awful, and he internalizes a lot of these, and they harm him. But he is a good and gentle person. And part of that, the romance, is him both coming to terms with his own humanity and recognizing his own humanity and communicating boundaries and consent and making choices with Meher. And I think that it is important to have stories, fantasy stories, romance stories, any kind of fiction, where men are given the opportunity to be compassionate, not only to other people, but to themselves, and to find a way through to be good and kind people that confront the reality that a lot of what they internalize comes from systems that are cruel, both to them and often to other people, often to women in a much bigger way. So that's something I quite like to see male characters do. And I think it's a very brave thing, and I think it's a very moving thing, and I enjoy reading it and I enjoy writing it. And I think a lot of people also feel the same.
Yeah, I enjoyed reading that. I like the way that the story sort of broke that trope of, arranged marriage and you're forced together and then you have to have the whole wedding night and whatever. But they had this really good conversation about consent and boundaries and how to move forward together. That was really cool, that journey they took together.
Thank you.
So, which leads to the next question. So, do you think that eventually this violent alpha male type character would phase out of science fiction fantasy as cultures worldwide start kicking out toxic masculinity? Or do you think it's one of those stereotypes that will stick around for much longer than expected?
No, I think it's going to stick around. And I think, and I also think that it's not, I don't think that the alpha male is an inherently bad thing. I think that, for one, a lot of women fantasize about it and write about it, I think it might change. I think that much like depicting violence against women, or depicting anything, doing so with intention and interrogation and thought will change how depictions of alpha men exist in fiction. I don't see patriarchy going anywhere anytime soon. So I can see many authors of different genders and stripes writing about alpha men in interesting ways, whether to break down the stereotype or explore whether there is a way to be a good alpha man, or what that can mean in a more equal society, or to explore the ways in which it is toxic. So I can see that continuing. But I also think that it has a place as a kind of romantic fantasy, and I do think that's something that I don't want to take away from people. And that can be something safe and interesting, again, if it's done in a way with intention and exploration and consideration. It's a little bit wishy-washy, but basically I think that a lot of the stuff that we write about doesn't reflect reality, or is often a way of coping with or having catharsis from reality. And so I don't see that going away as long as the world is the way it is, and I don't see the world necessarily changing swiftly. So
Okay. Yeah, makes sense, I guess. Okay, before I go into my next question, I'm going to ask the question from the audience. It's Misty again. I don't know if it's a spoiler, but you mentioned you might write a story about a certain character who appears in Realm of Ash. It's related to Empire of Sand. Are you any closer to making a decision? We'll read it.
I mean, I would love to. I don't know if I should say who the character is. Somebody's child. Let's say that. I had a whole idea for a story about Meher. Okay, fine, Meher's child, and I would like to write it at some point, but I am on deadline for 2 to 3 books at the moment, so it will be after that, and it depends whether anybody wants to pay me for it or if I'll just be releasing it free in a newsletter. So perhaps I would write it at some point, but I can't make any promises. It's really sweet that you're thinking of it, though.
Yeah. All right. Well, more surprises to look forward to, perhaps. Okay. So, and we were just talking about writing alpha males, right? So let's go on about writing stories. So stories are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about social change. The line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in fantasy books, whether it's epic fantasy, urban fantasy, paranormal romance. Certainly in some subgenres of fantasy like grimdark, violence against women is still often used as a catalyst for male characters' development or as a shorthand for showing how brutal the world is. Do you think this is an issue that writers in the genre have started tackling successfully in recent years? And do you have anything to suggest to SFF authors who wish to include violence against women in their books?
I think there have always been authors trying to tackle it in interesting and meaningful ways. I do think in recent years it has become a much bigger thing. We've seen it in sort of broader popular fiction as well, with the adaptation of things like The Handmaid's Tale, which is obviously a much older book, and a lot of the kind of things like Naomi Alderman's The Power, etc., dealing with questions of violence against women and women's power and patriarchy and toxicity. I think that I think it's quite difficult because, again, where do you draw the line between somebody interrogating something and just sort of recreating it? I'm getting into my own head, but basically, I think that there are people who have always tried to interrogate it and continue to interrogate it, but there is clearly still an audience for just violent books that just use violence against women as a catalyst. That is still not changing. But it is nice to see that there is a significant tranche of authors trying to change that and to either interrogate that violence when they depict it, or to make those stories about the women rather than as a catalyst for stories about men suffering because something happened to a woman that they know. I realize that sounds very negative, but basically I do think there are people doing good things, but I think that we are still in a cycle where there are lots of people recreating these same stories over and over again about women suffering. Oh, it's so sad for men, without thinking about what that means. And I hope that if readers and publishers continue to support the other books that do not just recreate that wholesale, we will see a continued change and shift.
Okay. So there is some violence in your books, sometimes graphic violence, and including violence against women. There are these warrior priests, there's plenty of toxic masculinity on display, as you mentioned earlier. How do you find a balance between showing the violence as an integral part of the story and giving the reader a realistic depiction of violence without being gratuitous?
It's who decides what's gratuitous. I think you have to draw a line in your head what you're comfortable with, and you have to go from there. So I had a lot of questions I had to ask myself while working on the Jasmine Throne, because it's a patriarchal world, an imperialistic world. That's bad. Lots of bad things happen to people. There's colonialism. There's a whole culture that has lost its language and has to deal with the consequences of that. So I knew that there's some kind of violence built into that world building, right? Because much like when those things happen in the real world, that means that there had been elements of genocide. I knew that there would be quite a lot of nasty stuff happening to women, whether on page or off page, and I had to decide what I would depict and what I wouldn't. So one of the things I don't know if I consciously chose to do, but I did not include, was I didn't include on scene or depicted rape, because I didn't want to. And I thought, I think there is enough evidence that this world is misogynistic without me including that. Now, that's not me saying that women authors shouldn't do that when they're exploring violence against women. It was just something I didn't want to do. So I didn't. And when I depicted violence against women, I tried consistently to humanize the women involved or demonize the men involved. So there is, for example, as you heard from the prologue, there's femicide, and it happens more than once. And at no point is it depicted as something that's positive, and the women involved have to deal with the consequences. So Princess Marlene, who does not burn in the prologue, has to deal with the consequences of knowing that 2 women she cared for really deeply were murdered. And she has to come to terms with that and the grief of that. So no violence is without consequence. And I think that for anybody wanting to depict violence against women, for whatever reason, the emotional devastation is often much more disturbing and true and will resonate than gristle and gore. Because really the whole point of violence is the emotional devastation. That's the consequence, rather than the physical act itself. And I think focusing on those things, and again on the humanity side of things, the interiority of women involved, is far more important.
Okay, that's a good answer.
Okay.
Well, okay, before I move on to my next question, just a little comment from Misty, who asked the question about the story you might write. And she says, it doesn't have to be right now.
I'll do my best to do it eventually.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, so my next question. So geek culture in general, including science fiction and fantasy, has had its share of critics saying that it's still too male dominated, despite there being a rising number of prominent, well-respected, and well-known female authors. Plus, there's still plenty of hostile, misogynist, and sexist behavior by male geeks towards female geeks. What do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books or cons, more welcoming for women and girls?
It's the same thing that needs to be done in every industry. There needs to be a way. There needs to be an accepted code of conduct, both formal and informal and cultural, that says what is acceptable and what isn't in behavior. And then when people cross those boundaries, there need to be consequences. I don't know a single woman who hasn't been in a position where men have harassed or made her uncomfortable, not just in publishing or in geek culture, be it at work or in a bar or whatever it might be. And then you tell somebody and they go, oh, are you sure he meant it that way? Are you sure it was like that? Don't take it so seriously. Just let it go, you know? It's a much bigger deal, and to actually try and get consequences for things that are done than it is for somebody to do the thing in the first place, when they're the one in the wrong. And I think until there is an accountability culture, not a shaming culture, just to be clear, but accountability for actions, where the men who harass women or make them uncomfortable or exclude them because of their gender face consequences and then have to make some kind of effort to correct their actions and their behavior in the future, it won't be a welcoming space. And I think that's doubly true for women of color in those spaces, or disabled women, or any woman who essentially is not the, you know, in every other way part of the norm. But again, that's true of every kind of subculture or culture that you can think of. And I think that there have been steps taken to try and ensure that geek culture is more welcoming, and I hope that people continue to do that. But yeah, it is a problem. It is a problem that women are made to feel excluded or harassed and don't necessarily know where to go when these things occur. I think one of the ways that a lot of women have dealt with this is by having their own geeky groups and communities or their own events, which isn't great because you really want to do things as a group. You want things to be universal, but nonetheless, having your own spaces allows you the freedom to feel safe and really enjoy something until everybody can behave and get on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so now everyone, I'm heading to my last few questions. So this is also your last chance to get in your questions for Tasha. There is one from Roxy again. It's an interesting question. Did you explore in your books the theme of internalized misogyny in women and pick-me girls' behavior, ready to shame hurt other women in order to look better for the male gaze?
Yeah, I think I kind of did. So in Empire of Sand, there's a sort of there is a female character who is working on behalf of the evil figure and is always enacting his violence. And Yeah. So I do depict that. And there are women who reinforce the system. So, for example, Meher's stepmother reinforces the system of patriarchy and racism that makes Meher's life so difficult. Now, I've had people sort of say, oh, you know, she was just a villain figure, like the evil stepmother, which I can understand. But I think that people can act from a desire to protect their loved ones or to try and protect their status in ways that might seem villainous, but they believe they're doing the right thing. Often women who protect patriarchy believe they're doing the right thing. Or, you know, they buy wholesale into the idea that if you're on the side of the dominant, often oppressive culture, you're safer, which may be true. Maybe you are safer than those other people over there. And that's a problem. But yeah, so I depicted it to some extent in Empire of Sand. Did I put it in the Jasmine Throne? I'm not sure.
Well, you just have to read the Jasmine Throne to find out.
Yes, and then you can tell me.
Okay, so I think that I'm going to ask you my last two questions.
Mhm.
They're sort of a two-part question. And it's a bit of an obvious question, but we ask everyone this. So you've been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. Could you tell us, why do you support the cause to end violence against women? And what do you think authors such as yourself can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
Whew. So, I mean, obviously violence against women is bad. But it is, I think I've certainly felt in recent days, especially in the UK with various things that have been in our news, that it is clear that violence against women is endemic in most cultures in the world. Even in places that believe that they are very egalitarian and that things are better, they're not. Women suffer from violence and mistreatment that we often don't hear about. We all know women in our lives who have suffered things that they have never spoken about to anybody. I myself have always been extremely grateful for the work that shelters and rape crisis centres and charity therapists do for women, because they have helped many people that I care about very deeply. It's just sort of an expected unspoken pain, which I think is awful, and it would be, I think, a better world to see violence against women at the very least decreased, if not eradicated entirely, though I would like to see that. I'm just a bit of a pessimist. What I think that authors like myself can do is that we have a voice, we are published, you know, we may not think that we have much of an impact, but certainly our books land in the hands of readers who can then either be harmed by our work or uplifted by it, or perhaps given an opportunity to rethink things in their own lives. So I don't think that authors like myself, or like many of the others involved in this, will necessarily be read by a raging misogynist who will suddenly change his mind about hating women. I don't think that's going to happen. But I do hope that people who are unsure quite how to articulate their feelings about violence against women, or women who don't know how to articulate their own experiences, or need some kind of catharsis, or want something to help them process, or, you know, anybody in that position might find something useful in our work. And I do think that the more authors and the more people in media who try and depict things in a meaningful way without just recreating masculine toxicity, the better that the overall culture will be, and the overall narrative about what it means to be a woman. And I think there was a second part to the question that I've completely forgotten.
No, you answered it.
No,
About
brilliant,
about
good.
the authors. Yeah. Yeah, okay, cool, awesome. So that brings us to the end, and we've been talking for almost an hour, which is pretty amazing.
It's awesome.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Tasha, for answering all the questions, and thank you everyone who asked questions as well. They were really good. Before we wrap up, I'm going to tell you once again about the amazing goodies that Tasha has donated to us that you can get your hands on. So, like I said before, one of the goodie bundles has already been snapped up. It was the Tasha Suri Fantasy Goodie Bundle, which had a copy of Empire of Sand, Realm of Ash, and the advanced reader's copy of the Jasmine Throne, and 2 character cards. Now that one's gone. But you can still get the 30-minute one-to-one video chat with Tasha. So this is for anyone who's an aspiring author. Tasha will be very happy to chat with you about the art and craft of writing and the business of publishing. And it's available to donors worldwide. Now, we also have plenty more author goodies available this week from authors or publishers, including Julia Quinn, S.J. Rosen, Reese Bowen, Bridget Kemmerer, Kieran Millwood Hargrave, Anna Stevens, Jodie Meadows, Julie Cheneda, and Zank Books. So more treats are going to be released every Thursday throughout March of this year. We've raised, let's see, I said before we raised $790, but actually we've raised $2,230 towards our $5,000 goal. So a bit more, but it is still our slowest fundraiser yet. Please do give generously before the fundraiser ends on 15th of April. All funds go towards Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. Now I'm going to share with everybody a slide where you can see the links. You can go to, let's see if this works. There you go. So here are the links to go to our Rally Up page. It's R4P Rally Up 2020, IWD 2021. And our chat box moderators are going to be putting it up in the chat box, the links for you, so you can just click and go. And if you want to find out more about Read for Pixels and check the schedule of all our upcoming authors, the link is bit.ly Read for Pixels. And that link is also going to go up in the chat box. So go check that out. And meanwhile, if you want to find out more about the Pixel Project, the work we do about violence against women and what you can do to help end it, you will go check out our website, www.thepixelproject.net. Yeah, that's it. So before we wrap up, Tasha, any announcements?
Yes, I have a book out. The Jasmine Throne is out in June, so I'd love it if you pre-order it or buy it when it comes out. That would be lovely. Apart from that, I'm just really enjoyed this. Thank you for having me, and I hope that you do meet your fundraising goals because this is a very worthy cause.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. And yeah, I had lots of fun too. So
brilliant.
Okay, so thank you everybody, and we will say good evening, good night, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and goodbye.